Hi guys, today we are moving on to Unit 2. So we are going to be taking notes today on 6.1 integers and 6.2 comparing integers. By now you should understand the process and know that you are required to follow along with notes. So please make sure you have your notebook ready, something to write with, so you can follow along and have these to access later on when we are going over these concepts live in class. Okay, so let's go ahead and start off with our essential question for today. And that is, how can you represent numbers that are less than 0? And if you don't know, we are actually going to be talking about that today. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, so to begin, let's talk about what an integer is. So an integer is the set of whole numbers and their opposites. And when we say opposites, we basically mean negative numbers. So all of the numbers you guys have been exposed to so far have been on, when we're talking about this number line right here below, they have been on this side of the number line. And those are all positive numbers or positive integers. Now we're going to be expanding into this negative side, and these ones are called negative integers. So the set of whole numbers and their opposites, which are called integers, include all of these numbers. But I want to be specific in that these are whole numbers only. So these don't include fractions. These don't include decimals. They are only whole numbers. Okay, so all of the numbers on the number line there, and as they expand beyond left and right, are included in that set of integers. All right, so you guys are more familiar with these, but let's go ahead and talk about them a little bit more. So positive numbers. So in your math career so far, these are probably the numbers that you've been exposed to. And a positive number is a number greater than 0 and we usually do not represent these with a sign, but you can. So they can be written with or without a positive sign. Usually we do not. So they can be written with or without a positive sign. But we usually do not. You will not usually see positive signs written with them. And remember, the positive sign looks just like what's in these parentheses, just that little plus. Okay, so those numbers are always greater than 0. They can be written with or without a positive sign. Okay, so when we talk about representing these positive numbers, sometimes we'll have a word sentence and we'll have to identify if the number is going to be a positive integer or a negative, or in some cases, even if we're going to add or subtract, which will still represent the positive and the negative integers. So some common words to represent positive integers are words such as gain. If someone gained, well, especially when we're talking about money or funds, if someone gains something, that would be a common word for positive. We can say up. Sometimes in a real life situation, we're talking about someone climbing, maybe an airplane going up. That would be representing a positive integer. If we say add, that would also be representing a positive gain. Let's see. If you see a word such as, we can even say positive, that would obviously represent positive. Gain, up, add, increase. I'm sure there are many, many more, but those are a few examples of words that would represent positive numbers. And maybe we can see some more in our examples. All right, so let's go ahead and move on to negative numbers. You can probably kind of get the gist. So positive number was one greater than 0. So a negative number must be one less than 0. A number that is less than 0 and these ones must be written with that negative sign. And so I'm going to put that in caps. Must be written with negative sign. And that is just going to look like a minus. So I'll put that right here in the parentheses for you. It's just going to look right there in that minus. I put it in the parentheses just so you could identify it, but usually you would not write it in parentheses. You would just put it right wherever it is next to that number. Okay, so a negative number is a number that is less than 0 and must be written with the negative sign. So as you look up here back at this diagram, the negative integers are going to be the ones when we're talking about a horizontal number line to the left, whereas the positive ones are going to be the ones to the right, and they increase as we go right. I'm going to go back here and write that. So they increase going right, and they decrease going left. That's all values on the horizontal number line. Okay, so some common words for a negative number. So once again, once we see these in a real life example, we can say a loss or loses. We can say down. We can say decrease. Oops. Decrease. Those are all examples of words that represent a negative. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at these examples right here, and we're going to write a positive or a negative integer, and we're going to determine if a positive or a negative integer represents the situation, and then we're going to write one to represent that situation. Okay, so these examples right here below. So it says write a positive or negative integer that represents the situation, just how I had stated. All right, so let's go ahead and start off with this. So what this says is a hiker climbs 900 feet up a mountain. So let's identify our keywords. Up, we see that in the positive, and 900. So in this case, it would be positive 900. And usually with positives, we would not write the plus sign, but remember, it's not wrong if you do. But in this case, since we're identifying the difference, I am going to write the positive signs. All right, you have a debt of $24. This is a word that we can add to the negative integers, because debt actually means as if you owe it. So it's money you do not have, you owe it. And that would represent a negative word. And our value is 24. So this should be negative 24. All right, a student loses, let's circle the keyword, 5 points for being late to class. Always be on time. All right, minus 5 points to that student. And a savings account earns $10. We can add that word to our list of positive words, earns, because as if you're earning for chores, that is going to be a positive number, positive 10. All right. So just want to be clear on this concept right here. Two numbers that are the same distance from 0 on a number line, but on opposite sides of 0 are called opposites. Okay, so I'm going to highlight that because that's a big idea here. So these are called opposites. So for example, let's think of an example of opposites on our own. So I am going to say, oops, I am still writing in highlighter. Let's go back to this. So I'm going to say graph the integer and its opposite. So let's go ahead and try this out. And the value that we are going to have is going to be 2. So we're going to want to graph that integer and its opposite. So let's go ahead and draw a number line. I'm going to put 0 right in the center. And I'm going to go 1, 2. And remember, our values, when we go left, decrease. So I'm going to go -1, -2. And I am going to graph 2 right here by putting a little dot. And I'm also going to put a dot on -2. And you know, this is the integer and its opposites. They should be the same distances from 0 as long as you drew your scale right. And you see that they are. All right, so when you're asked to graph an integer and its opposite, all you do is basically draw a number line if it's not already there for you, and put little dots on the point for the integer and the point of its opposite. Remember, the opposite will always just be the same whole number with a different sign. So 2, if it's positive, we put a negative, -2 and +2 are opposites. Okay, let's go ahead and move on with our lesson. And now we are moving on to section 6.2, which is actually comparing integers. So in this section, we will talk about which integers are greater and how to know when something is bigger or smaller. So this is similar to our diagram above when we talked about positive and negative integers. So positive integers, remember, we're going to be on the right of 0, and they keep increasing as you go right. Whereas negative are on the left, and they keep decreasing as you go left. So we also have something called a vertical number line. That's the one that goes up and down. And for a lot of people, this is easier for them to tell. So if you're 100 feet in the sky, obviously you're higher than 0 feet at sea level. So this one, as we go up, it increases. And as we go down, it decreases. Okay, but let's start to think about this, because this is something that, at least when we get started, can be a common mistake, because we think about the larger number and we're so used to, let's say, 6 being bigger than 2, but it's actually the opposite for negatives. So the way I remember it, I like to tie it back to a real life example, is that, let's say, for example, you're purchasing something. So when my husband and I were purchasing a house, the more negative things about the house, the worse the house got, right? If there, let's say, the door was broken and the garage opener didn't work and the sink faucet wasn't working, we don't want a house with all these negatives, right? The less negatives, the better. So I am just going to say the less negative, the greater the number. Okay, so think about when you have plans with your friends. If you have plans with your friends, you're going to want to do something that's the most fun, not something that has all these negatives. So you're going to pick the one that in this case is actually greater. So the less negatives, the better it actually is. All right, so move more toward the positive. Okay, so now let's actually try comparing these numbers. So in this case, we have -3 blank -2. So we're going to use the greater than, less than, or equal to signs here. So -3 and -2. When we look above over here on the number line, we could see that -3 is more to the left than -2, which is right here. And also remember, the less negative, the greater the number is. So in this case, remember, our mouth always wants to eat the bigger value. In this case, -2 is the bigger value. Remember, it is greater. The less negative, the greater it is. All right, now in this case, +6 or -6. I am going to write a little thing right here. Positives are always greater than negatives. So positives will always be greater than negatives. So that one's a no-brainer. All right, so positives will always be greater than negatives. So in this case, our mouth wants to eat the bigger one, which is +6. All right, -2 and 0. Same thing with 0. 0 is actually considered a neutral number. It's neither positive nor negative. But of course, it's still going to be more right on our horizontal number line, which means it's greater than -2. So 0 is going to be greater. -5 and -10. Remember, the less negative, the greater the number. We want less negatives when we're buying something important. So we're going to say -5 is greater. And in this case, once again, we have -4 and +4. Remember, any positive number is going to be greater than negative number. So +4 is going to be that value right there. All right. So if you need any extra examples, remember, you can always rewind, go back, and that way you can have an extra example. But let's finish off with these last two. So now we're actually going to order these integers from least to greatest. So we should know that least is going to be a negative number. And remember, the bigger the negative number looks, the actual less it is. It's like opposite rules to positive. Okay, so here I see -4. That is actually going to be the least number, because the more negatives, the less negatives, the greater it is. The more negatives, the more negative it is. Okay, so -4 first, then it looks like -3, then we're going to go -2. And from here, all of our numbers are positive. Remember, of course, you use the same rules when you're ordering, which is the smaller the positive, and then you build up. So 3, +3, and then +4. All right, we got them all. Let's move on to this next example. Once again, remember opposite rules for negatives. If it's a bigger negative number, it's actually less. So -20 is going to be the smallest number. Then -10 is going to be that next smallest. Then -5. And in this case, we are left with just positives. You guys should already know how to order those. We're going to do the smallest one first, which is 15, and then 25. All right, so that is how you order. Keep in mind, remember that the negatives, the bigger the value is next to the negative, actually the smaller it is, because we don't want all of these bad things. If there's all these bad things when we're purchasing a house, we're probably less likely to get it. That house is worse than the other one that has just maybe one negative thing. Okay, so let's talk about one final aspect on these notes, and that is absolute value. So absolute value actually measures the distance from 0. And the thing about a distance from 0 is it's always going to be positive. There's no such thing as a negative distance, right? You always have to travel somehow. Even if you're traveling east, west, north, south, distances are always going to be counted. So this is always going to be positive. Always going to be positive. And I will show you what an absolute value symbol looks like right now. So absolute value symbol looks like 2 straight lines, just like this. So if you saw this, and let's say -3 was inside, that would be asking you what the absolute value of -3 is. So I just told you that it's always going to be positive because it measures the distance. So the distance from -3 to 0 is +3. If I had the absolute value of a number like 6, it's just going to stay as 6 because the distance from 6 to 0 or 0 to 6 on our number line is just going to be 6. Let me give you a few more examples. Try this one yourself. The absolute value of -2, what would that be? If you said +2, you are correct. What about the absolute value of 247? Correct, I think. +247, right? So it'll always be positive. Absolute value is represented by these symbols. So I'm going to put these over here. It's just 2 straight lines. And remember, that means the distance from 0 and that it's always going to be positive. Okay, so anytime you see those symbols, that is asking you to represent the absolute value of something. So quickly, I'm going to give you one more example in comparing 2 numbers. So what if I had the absolute value of -3 compared to 4? So first we'd have to solve for what the absolute value of -3 is, which is 3. And we're comparing that to the value of 4. And of course, 4 is the bigger number. They're both positive. So 4 would be greater. Okay? So anytime you see the absolute value, simplify that, solve what the absolute value for it is, and then compare the values. All right?